That wingtip did hit the ground, but then the pilots went back flying again. Why would you go flying if you were already missing part of your wing, and how dangerous was that? Here's a full video. I like the way she said, hey, the wing hit the ground. Anyway, this is taking place in LaGuardia. There's two major airports that serve New York City, LaGuardia and JFK. I still fly into JFK. LaGuardia is too small of an airport to service a 747, but I used to fly in there all the time at the regionals. They were landing on runway 13, which is not that common of a runway, and this is what the approach plate looks like going into runway 13. As you can see at the top, it's called the river visual, which means the pilots are using landmarks to gauge exactly where they're supposed to be in order to get lined up with the runway. You can see we're flying over the Hudson. That's the river that we're flying over, so we make sure that we're on top of that. But then you see landmarks like Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty, but this is the best part right here. When we turn here at Zlinger, and I hope I'm saying that correct because all these different fixes, especially in different cities, mean different things. Sometimes they're the name of a famous person that's from there, or the sports team that's there, or a famous athlete. Anyways, they all have these different fixes that are named after people or things, and sometimes you'll say it wrong and then you don't realize exactly what that name or what that fix is supposed to be called until the controller reads it back to you, but I'm guessing that's how you say this. Here at Zlinger, the plane is going to make a steep right-hand turn, and that means the people that are sitting on the right side of the plane here are going to have an amazing view all the way in, all the way up the city, and then this bank, as they come down, they'll have a view of Central Park and everything all the way down. The first time I flew this approach, I was the one flying. I was not expecting to go into runway 13. I was so busy. I was kind of new when I was flying in there. I was so busy with everything that was going on that I didn't even have a chance to look out the window because I was so focused on what was happening, flying the plane and getting all coordinated, because it's not a normal approach that I was used to flying into when I would go into LaGuardia. And the funny thing is that we turned in, we came in, we landed. It was a pretty smooth landing. And I told you before, when I used to fly passengers, a lot of times I'd like to stand by the door and say goodbye to people as they get off the plane. And I was standing there, and everyone that was on the right side of the plane, I could tell who was on the right side because they'd say, oh my gosh, that was the coolest view of the city I've ever seen. Thank you so much for taking us that way. Like I had any say-so in what we were gonna do, but they were like, oh my God, that was so cool. And I was thinking, oh yeah, cool, glad you liked it. I was so busy, I never really paid attention to have a chance to look out the window to see how cool it was. And I've actually never seen it as a passenger. And the few times that I've done runway 13, I was just focused on what was going on flying the plane. I didn't really have a chance to, because you're at a low altitude, you're getting ready to land, a lot of stuff is going on. So I didn't really have a chance to just stare out the window, not like I normally just stare out the window as we're landing, but you get what I mean. I freeze framed this picture here so you can see that this is runway 13 as it is on the ground here. And the important thing to realize as you look at this picture is that the 1 and the 3 are directly in the middle of the runway. And that means you as a passenger should never be seeing it like you see here. The pilot should be seeing it as we're coming in and landing, and the main landing gear should be directly over that. What should not be over that is the wingtip. That means that the rest of the plane, the body of the plane, is off to the side of the runway, possibly off the runway in some airports. So you should never see runway 1 and 3 like that and never have the wingtip touching it, because that means the plane is really far offset to the left. The other thing to see is look where the wing starts to hit the ground. This is at the very start of the runway. Now runway 13 is a relatively short runway. It's only about 7,000 feet long. But pilots, regardless of how short the runway is, we're typically aiming to land 1,000 feet down the runway. There's markers down there, we call them the 1,000-foot markers. They're these big bars that we're aiming to land on. And the reason that we do that is so that way that 1,000 feet behind us is a buffer in case something were to go wrong. Now, if these pilots were to do what you'll see sometimes general aviation pilots do, which is aim to land at the very start of the runway, or on the numbers as we say, if these pilots had aimed to do that and then miscalculated, they would have hit well before the runway even started. The wing would have actually went down and hit right around here, which is a very sharp edge at the start of the runway. And that would have been a lot worse because it would have spun the whole plane around. It would have been a real mess. Now you're wondering, they've already ripped off part of the wing. Why are they taking off and going around? Well, my guess is, and again, I'm not up there, my guess is that they made the decision to do the go around before the plane actually took off. It takes a few seconds for these engines to gather enough power to suck in enough air and actually take the plane back up in the air again. So even though we're moving, it's not instantaneous. On a smaller plane, on a propeller plane, when you add the power, boom, it's instantaneous. But on a turbine engine, it takes a few more seconds for things to spool up in order to get the aircraft back up in the air again. Bigger the engine or bigger the plane, the more spool up time. So on a 747, if you need to make a go around, you hit it to make a go around, it still takes 1 or 2 seconds for everything to spin back up so you can go in the air. So they were landing short, landing to the side, banked, everything was going wrong. They probably made the decision before that wingtip struck and hit the ground, but it took a while before they could get back up in the air again. Listen, as you can hear the engine start to actually pick up power even though the wing is on the ground, meaning they already knew it was going to be a bad landing. Listen here.
Hey, that wing hit the ground. It's first off.
Truthfully, they should have done a go-around earlier. They waited way too long. There was no way for the plane to safely land in the middle of the runway. They were short. They were in a bank. There was a bunch of things going wrong, and they should have never even got that close to the ground. A go-around should have been attempted probably 50 or 100 feet earlier, because the amount of correction that was going to be needed to get centered was going to be too great, and they were going to be at risk of dragging the wing, which is exactly what happened. They would not have been lined up with the runway there. My guess is they had somewhat of a crosswind, and because they didn't have the correction in, they got blown over to the side and then tried to make too late of a correction to get in. But I'm just looking out the window and I don't have a lot of information to know that, but that would be my guess of maybe what was going on. Now, for those of you that are nervous flyers and you're looking out your window and you're seeing something like this going on, which I'm guessing will probably never happen in your lifetime, but if you were to be this lady and you were to be a nervous flyer, and she sounds pretty calm, all considering she just watched the part of the wing get shaved off, but you would be, if you were a nervous flyer, wondering how dangerous is this? We're about to take off and part of the wing is missing. So here's the thing to know. These wingtips aren't really essential when it comes down to the lift that is generated by the aircraft. It does help to a degree with some things, but really they're there for fuel efficiency. Fuel is very expensive, especially jet fuel. So by having these winglets out there, they're really designed more to make the plane more fuel efficient. So there's also stories over the years of military aircraft where they've had large chunks of their wings blown off in combat and were able to continue to fly. So the aircraft are designed, obviously commercial aircraft are not designed for parts of the wing to be blown off, but the amount of lift and the things that these planes can do with a lot of damage to them is incredible. And that's because the engineers designed things so it's not just right at the very edge of possibly working. There's a huge safety margin when it goes into designing these aircraft, the wings, the engines, a lot of redundancies. So even if you were to have a chunk of your wing missing, the aircraft would probably still be able to fly fine. Not ideal, but you'd be able to come back in and land again. There have been cases where there's been an explosion or something that has gone wrong. Part of the wing is missing and they were able to still fly and land fine. So if you were to be looking out your window and you were to see something like this happen, your plane's probably going to be fine. Now, if the whole wing is missing, okay, you're in trouble. But if just part of the wingtip is missing, you're not going to be able to fly a long distance because you're going to run out of gas soon, but the wing will still be generating enough lift for you to get back around and land again. So I wouldn't worry about it too much if you saw it happen again. Now, from the captain, if the captain was flying, or if the first officer was flying here, the captain is probably going to take the controls somewhere right around this point and come in and land the plane himself, because he or she is going to want to be in control of that landing if it's windy or this other pilot is now rattled. And if you're the first officer and that was the captain landing the aircraft, then what you're thinking is, I'm definitely not opening this door until everybody's off the plane, because for sure everyone's going to think that I did that landing. So those would be going on from the two pilots' perspective. But if you are looking out the window and you do see something like this happen, don't freak out. Something that I was kind of laughing about here was you'll notice like as they were rolling out and getting ready to exit the runway, the plane was jerking back and forth like that. And I know from experience, what happens is these planes get an auto brake setting and you have to push on the brakes to release the auto brake setting. Otherwise, the plane will just basically come to a complete stop. And it's a real tough strategy about how much you push down in order to get the brakes to release. So you kind of have to press a little bit hard. So if you don't do it smoothly, you get the nose of the plane going up and down, and it's kind of an abrasive thing. So after everything else that was going on, obviously this wasn't a passenger aircraft, but if you're flying passengers and you do have auto brakes, it's kind of tricky sometimes, and you'll feel it as a passenger. The plane's rolling out, it's smoothly landing, and then at the end there's this like jerk, and you saw the nose of the aircraft go down. Take a look at this. You see that jerk right there? That's probably because the pilot is pushing his feet hard on the brakes to release the auto brakes. And so you see that big jerk down the nose. So you as a passenger have probably felt that before. That's what's going on. That's what it looks like from the outside. It's harder than you might think. There are other ways to do it on a Boeing aircraft. They aren't in my airline's procedures to do it. There is a way to get it to smoothly release out, but they don't really care so much about the smoothness as they do about the plane safely landing. So they don't want you to do this special strategy, if you will, to make the auto brakes go off smooth, because they don't want you to do something by accident and then create an actual problem. So they'd rather just have people jerk a little bit. Obviously, you shouldn't be having a drink in your hand or anything like that. You'll be happy to be landed, especially if your landing was that wobbly to start with. Now, I've never flown this aircraft, but you might be wondering what all these things are in the aircraft. These are just different antennas and all kinds of cool stuff. And I wish I could tell you what kind of cool stuff is on there, but I'm not cool enough to know those things. But that's why it looks different than a normal plane. All those things are different antennas and radars. I don't know what they do, but I'm guessing it's something really cool. And maybe one day somebody who I'm flying that flies these can come and tell me when I'm flying them on their plane. I promise I won't tell anybody. People don't believe I'm a real pilot anyway, so even if I did tell them on one of these videos, people would never believe me. All right, let's talk about this plane as it crabs in here. You can see the plane is not lined up going directly down the runway. The plane is facing us, and I'm guessing the runway is 20 to 30 degrees to the right. When the wind is not coming directly down the runway, the plane comes in at an angle. The plane is always going to end up facing the direction of the wind. So in this case, you can see the wind would be off to the left-hand side of the plane, and the runway was going to be off the right-hand side because they're going to be turned at an angle. And then when the plane is coming in at an angle like this, we call it crabbing, because crabs don't walk straight ahead, they walk at an angle. Now there's several things that go wrong here, starting with this point right here where it looks like the pilot flares a bit too much and probably has some extra speed because of the amount of wind. And so by adding that flare, you can see the plane goes up in the air again right before it plops onto the runway. Now I have done this landing more than once, so I can tell you exactly what it feels like from the pilot or as a passenger, because I've had it happen to both. What happens is when you have a very windy day, the plane is required, or the airline or whoever you're flying for usually requires you to carry some extra speed, because they don't want you to come in at the normal speed and have that wind go away, because then if you lose your wind that's coming off onto your wings, you're going to just lose altitude really quickly, and it's very dangerous. So they want you to carry that extra speed as you get over the runway, and then you can pull the power out. Now here is the problem. If you flare too much, meaning you pull that nose up too much, what ends up happening is the plane now is going faster than it normally really wants to for landing. So if you pull it up a little bit too high, it goes back up in the air again. And the problem is, once you get it back up in the air again, you can't push the nose forward, because if you push the nose forward, you are at risk of pushing that nose to hit the ground first. You never want that. We've talked about that before. So you're now at this tricky situation about adding enough power or holding it off the ground to get the mains to touch without plopping it on the ground. It's a very delicate thing to do once you balloon up like that. It's very tricky. In some cases, some airlines are probably going to want you to do a go-around, because what ends up happening is the plane now is carrying that energy. The descent towards the runway has stopped. So now you're 20 or 30 feet off the runway, and then you're going to be there until the energy runs out. And when the energy runs out, boom, you slam onto the runway. And then it's a whole other mess that you're dealing with. See here how they go back up in the air, and then there's no smoke, and then they come down hard, and then you see the smoke coming out behind as the wheels have hit the ground. The tricky part here is that flare is what makes your landing a lot smoother as a passenger. So as we're descending down, that flare slows the descent rate into the ground. So if we don't flare, you have a very firm landing on the ground. And in some cases, I have made the decision when I'm landing on a very windy day or a strong crosswind, I don't really care about making it smooth. I just want to get the plane safely on the ground in the middle of the runway so I don't drag an engine or hit a wingtip or anything like that. And so I make the decision, okay, there's not going to be a lot of flare. It's going to be a firm landing, but we're going to do it exactly where we're supposed to be in the middle of the runway. Because if you flare too much, this is what happens. So you'll see a very firm landing. So sometimes that firm landing where people say, oh, it must have been a Navy pilot, that firm landing is done on purpose. They're doing that because they don't want to balloon back up in the air and have a plopped landing or something more dangerous where you don't land and then the crosswind pushes you off to the side of the runway. So there are cases where that firm landing is done on purpose. In some cases, it's going to be more firm than you would want it to be, but you're trying to avoid this situation right here. And then the next thing you see happen is this wing go down so much. Well, that is the direction that the wind is coming from. And that's the next tricky thing that the pilot's trying to deal with. You see, a lot is happening at once here. The plane went back up in the air. Both pilots realized, uh-oh, this is not going to be a good situation. Now you're dealing with a crosswind. The plane is ballooned up back in the air. You're probably getting pushed a bit to the side of the runway. You need to keep your wings level. This is a 4-engine aircraft. You can't really land it in a bank without hitting one of the pods or hitting one of the engines. So a lot is happening. Now, when you land and you have a crosswind, one of the things you have to do is put your wing that has the wind coming out down. You have to put that wing down because the wind has a bunch of extra lift that's coming on that wing. And if you let the wind get under it, it will push the right wing down. So you have to put the ailerons, meaning the control that we have, you have to turn it a little bit like this. So that way that wing doesn't get any extra lift, slamming your right wing down. The problem is how much do you turn that wing? You do it too much and you get what you saw there. You don't do it enough and the right wing hits the ground. So it's a real art. It's a mix of an art and a science when you're doing these crosswind landings. You can see here that they were trying to get that wing down, but the pilot did too much and almost ended up slamming that left wing into the ground. And when all this stuff is going on, what happens is the pilots are kind of rattled, if you will. Not rattled as like, oh my gosh, we don't know what's going on, but so many things are happening all at once. Everyone's trying to pay attention to make sure the plane doesn't go off the runway or something else doesn't go wrong. And what happens is you break out of your rhythm. And what will happen when a landing is bad like this, and I know because I've done plenty of them or been sitting in a third seat as something like this has happened. And what ends up happening is the pilots start talking about it right there. Instead of doing what we're supposed to do, which is get the plane parked and then we can talk about it. They just start talking about it immediately right after the plane slows down and you get off the runway. And what that does is it breaks up the rhythm and the flow of all the things that are supposed to happen. And typically, once you exit the runway, one of the first things that you're supposed to do is start what we call cleaning up the aircraft. And one of those things to do is we put the flaps up. You'll notice here that they're well off the runway and they're taxiing into park and the flaps are still down. And instead of getting focused on the things that they really needed to focus on, which is finishing the flight and parking the aircraft, I'm guessing that they're talking about what was going on. And that's not really a huge deal, but you can miss things. And putting the flaps up is not a big deal, but you can miss something that is a big deal. So just as something that I try to remember for myself, even though I'm guilty of talking about something right after it happened, is wait, get the plane parked. Once we get the plane parked, we can talk about it. And sometimes you'll hear a crew member say that, like, let's just park the plane and then we'll talk about it. Because you have plenty of time from that point while you're riding in the van or whatever else is going to happen next. You have plenty of time to talk about everything that just happened 2 minutes ago. So you wait the extra 30 seconds and you'll be fine. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one over here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.